5 a.m. in New York City. Good morning, I'm Vonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. Layoff risk. Federal workers go to court as U.S. government agencies prepare to take action on firing plans. Global bond jitters. Yields are climbing as the French Prime Minister resigns, and Japan is set for a new leader. And Boeing signals an output hike for its 737 MAX jets as early as October. So remember, we finished with records last week. The S&P up more than 1%, same for the Nasdaq. Well, it looks like we are pointed higher once again this week. Russell, Nasdaq 100, S&P all higher. The action might be elsewhere though. Let's look at the bond universe, because we are seeing bonds sell off around the world. Not quite as significant here in the United States. Nevertheless, we are seeing a move lower in yields. 475 on the 30-year. The 2-year is up to 357, so a little bit of curve flattening there. If we look around the world, though, that's where the action is. In the last hour and 15 minutes, you had the French Prime Minister resign, Lecornu, after a cabinet was named that was basically the same as the old cabinet. Opposition to that, and you can see a much weaker euro today. In fact, it weakened substantially since that resignation. 116.68. It had been trading earlier this morning above 117. And then in Japan, Takaichi is said to be the next LDP leader and the presumptive new prime minister, and that has the yen weakening by 2% today, even though we thought it had been at least partially priced in. The yen trading well above 150. Let's get over to London now and some individual movers to watch. And Valerie Teitel. Valerie, good morning.
Good morning, Vonnie. Let's start with what's going on in France. We are seeing French banks very much on a back foot so far this morning. Soc Gen down 5.4%. BNP Paribas down 4.5%. This is on the back of that surprise resignation from the Prime Minister Lecornu, lasting just 27 days in office. But Vonnie, the market is starting to question just when this political crisis could morph into an economic one. And hence, we're seeing banks on the back foot as well of those OAT bond yields spiking. Well, we have an eye on French politics. We also have to keep an eye on what the White House is up to. A Reuters report that the U.S. is eyeing an equity stake in critical minerals. We're seeing critical metals jump 77% in pre-market trade. This would give the U.S. access to one of the largest rare mineral mines in Greenland. They want to convert essentially a loan into an equity stake. This is something they did similar with Intel a few months ago. It would give them around an 8% equity stake in critical metals group. Lastly, let's move on to some upgrades. Morgan Stanley upgrading Micron to a buy. That share is up 3.5%. Morgan Stanley very bullish on their memory chips and thinking you can get double-digit growth in the next few quarters. Bonnie?
Valerie, thank you so much. Valerie Teitel there in London. And later this hour, we'll discuss the economic risks around the world with Kallum Pickering of Peel Hunt. Plus, Chris Watling of Longview Economics joins us as he sees bubble traits in the U.S. stock market. But first, our reporters around the world for the latest political developments. We have Caroline Conan in Paris, Alice French in Tokyo, and Kasia Klimaszinska in Washington, D.C. A lot to discuss. Let's start with France. Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu just resigning about an hour and 15 minutes ago, hours after his cabinet was unveiled. French stocks declining, bond yields rising substantially on the back of this development. Let's get straight now to Caroline Conan in Paris. Caroline, did President Macron really think this new cabinet, which is basically the same as the old cabinet, would satisfy the populace?
Well, clearly that's the entire question. The resignation of Sebastien Lecornu was very quick, less than 24 hours after he named his new cabinet last night. But clearly this new cabinet was almost a copy and paste of the previous government of François Bayrou, who collapsed, as you know, early September. And you had some unexpected comebacks in the government, such as Bruno Le Maire coming back as defense minister, which angered the Republican Party. The problem is that within the Macron's camp, you needed the support as well of the Republican Party. So they had a crisis meeting planned, in fact, just happening right now that they maintain, but the government has already collapsed, so they were supposed to discuss whether they were going to withdraw from this government. Lecornu didn't really see any outcome with what he said just now in Matignon, the Prime Minister's office. There was too much partisanship with view to the next presidential elections, and every single party trying to defend their own program, every single party thinking that their own budget proposals would be adopted, which is something that is not really possible when you have a parliament that is still fragmented into 3 blocks. And Lecornu, speaking just a few minutes ago, also saying the opposition didn't acknowledge that there was a change in method, that he promised not to use Article 49.3 in the Constitution, which allows you to force a bill through Parliament. He wanted to give power to Parliament back. That wasn't enough. He decided to resign.
So what happens next, Caroline? Where does France go from here? Because it's not just the electorate, right? It's the markets. We're seeing a massive move in markets today.
Yes, and this market move is not going to end anytime soon. 86 basis points currently on the spread between the French and the German 10 years. Some analysts saying this could reach 100 basis points if we see new snap elections. Clearly, everything is in the hands of President Emmanuel Macron right now. Will he speak tonight? Will he address the nation to kind of understand what is going to be his next move? He doesn't have many cards left in his hands. One card is obviously naming a new prime minister, but he's done that 5 times already. Another card would be to resign or call new snap legislative elections.
Caroline Conan in Paris, thank you. We'll be watching very closely. In Japan, the election of a pro-stimulus leader has shaken up global markets too. The Nikkei surging in the session, while the yen and longer-term bond yields are tumbling. Bloomberg's Alice French is in Tokyo. Alice, what are these market moves signalling about expectations?
Morning. Yes, you join me after what's been a very busy day in Tokyo. Of course, we now know that we have Sanae Takaichi as the new leader of the ruling LDP. As you mentioned, she's pro-stimulus, she's pretty conservative, and she's also a heavy metal fan, if that's at all relevant. But yes, it's been a good day for stocks. We're seeing this revival of this so-called Takaichi trade. We know that Takaichi has talked about more investment into strategic industries. So that's things like defense, tech, chips, software, etc. And so we've seen those sectors really rising today. The big defense names up over 10%, chips rising. Overall good sentiment for stocks. On the other end, you know, we have seen bonds pressured. We're seeing the 10-year JGB yield up at the highest since 2008. We've seen the yen pressured, as you mentioned, and this is around concerns that, you know, we know that Takaichi is going to push for more government spending. That's bound to kind of fuel nerves around the public deficit. She's also a slightly sort of dovish take on monetary policy, which may potentially weigh on the BOJ. We know that we have another rate hike decision coming at the end of this month, and we are seeing expectations receding for that near-term rate hike, which is also pressuring the yen, and also not great news for banking stocks. So we shall see how that plays out. We know that obviously the LDP is in a minority in both houses of parliament, so whether or not she can actually move forward with all of these policies that she's spoken about sort of remains to be seen. But at least in the short term, we're definitely seeing, you know, positive sentiment for equities, but some nerves around bonds and the yen.
It's fascinating because you say pro-stimulus and dovish, but she's also been likened to Margaret Thatcher as well. President Trump is going to be in Tokyo at the end of this month. Does Takaichi's win have any implications for US-Japan relations?
Yeah, as you mentioned, she has been likened to Thatcher. She's also pretty similar to Abe in quite a lot of her policy stances, the late Shinzo Abe, previous Prime Minister of Japan, who we know was pretty close with Trump. That may help her. But yeah, we're expecting Trump in town just before Halloween. And we know that during her campaign, Takaichi had, you know, mentioned that if the US-Japan trade deal that was agreed back in July, if it's implemented and it doesn't really benefit Japan or it doesn't go particularly smoothly, she might consider renegotiation. Now, that may not go down well with Trump, so we'll have to see how that goes. But you know, it's going to be a really big first job for her as Prime Minister, we assume.
Alice, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Alice French in Tokyo. And back in the US then, the government is into its 6th day of a shutdown now. Unions representing hundreds of thousands of federal workers have gone to court to try and block mass firings by the Trump administration, which could start coming later today. For more, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Kasia Klimaszinska, who leads our breaking news coverage in Washington. So, Kasia, where does this legal challenge leave the risk of mass layoffs?
Hello. As you mentioned, we are now in the 6th day of this shutdown that started on October 1st because lawmakers couldn't agree on how to fund the government going forward. So all the non-essential operations of the government are halted, and those workers are concerned that they may lose their jobs permanently because around October 1st, President Trump said so. He threatened that he will look at the agencies that don't align their mission with the views of this administration might see cuts. There's about 650,000 employees of the federal government that are now staying at home and not receiving pay. And so they use their union to ask a judge to make sure that Trump doesn't make any of those cuts permanent. The unions argue that there's basically no law that would allow for such a thing, that the lapse in funding is just temporary and really shouldn't lead to any permanent changes at those agencies. Also, over the weekend, unfortunately, we didn't see any progress between the two sides, so between Democrats and Republicans. They were just trading accusations, but there was no progress towards reopening the government.
Well, elsewhere, talks between Israel and Hamas begin today to discuss the U.S.'s peace plan for Gaza. What do we know about the state of diplomacy in the Middle East right now?
So we had this fascinating report from Axios. We know that President Trump presented a 20-point plan for the Middle East. He hosted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel here at the White House last Monday. And then on Friday, Hamas came back with this kind of yes, but response. So Trump got on the phone with Bibi again. And according to Axios, he kind of snapped back at Netanyahu when Netanyahu wasn't entirely pleased with Hamas's response. Trump said, this is a win. Take it. So today, the two sides, Hamas and Israel, are negotiating via intermediaries. The representatives of the U.S. are there as well, including Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner.
All right, Kasia, thank you so much. That is Bloomberg's Kasia Kimishinska in Washington. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. Boeing is said to be preparing suppliers for increased production of its 737 MAX planes as early as this month. Sources say the plane maker may make 42 jets a month. Boeing's monthly rate had been capped at 38 last year after a near catastrophic incident. Shares of Aston Martin are falling after paring back its outlook for a second time this year, citing the impact of U.S. tariffs and broader economic challenges. The company now expects sales to fall by a mid to high single-digit percentage this year and no longer anticipates positive cash flow during the second half. And sources say Stellantis is planning to invest about $10 billion in the U.S. The investments could be funneled into plants in states such as Illinois and Michigan and may include fresh investments into Dodge and possibly the Chrysler brand. It's preparing the announcement while lobbying the Trump administration in recent days to waive or soften a possible 25% tariff. Coming up, more on the political spillover effect of the shutdown with Kallum Pickering of Peel Hunt. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
We had from March until now to try to work this thing out, but Republicans refused to talk to and work with Democrats. So that we could come to a meeting of the minds. They waited to the last second and then walk away, not being in Washington, D.C.
U.S. government shutdown then extending into a sixth day. Federal workers asking a U.S. judge to immediately block any mass firings threatened by the Trump administration. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett telling CNN, quote, "I think that everybody is still hopeful that when we get a fresh start at the beginning of the week, that we can get the Democrats to see that it's just common sense to avoid layoffs." Kallum Pickering of Peel Hunt weighs in on the rising risks, writing this. The risk to watch is that a political storm generates market and economic spillovers. He's chief economist at Peel Hunt and joins us now. So, Kallum, what are the immediate risks if this does continue?
Well, I think the first point to note here is that the base case that government shutdowns add to uncertainty, reduce confidence, and put downside risks to growth, I think that still plays out. But what I would just note, and this is not just true for the US, this is true for all advanced economies, the bond market, which is really the conductor of the global market orchestra at the moment. The bond market moves, everyone else has to just dance to the tune. The bond market is not reacting in the same way to weaker growth expectations than it normally would. So conventional wisdom would be anything that slows growth pushes down yields. This is not happening. What slows growth adds to worries about long-term debt and pushes up yields. And so I think what you've got here is actually basically badly behaved politicians on a collision course with the bond market. This is true in America, as it is in France, as it is in Japan, as it is in the UK, Italy, and Germany. This is basically now the standard playbook around the world, and every 2 weeks I'm on here basically discussing the same thing. And until someone actually just faces down these long-term debt issues, this is going to be the story as far as the eye can see, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, we're seeing huge moves in the French bond market. The OAT bund spread now at almost 90 basis points. How concerned are you that this is going to create contagion around Europe and the broader universe? I mean, you just mentioned that we're seeing bonds sell off really around the world, Japan as well today.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about spreads as much as we want, but just notice, if one of the G7 countries has any political issue, any fiscal issue, the whole bond market now sells off. Right? February, we had UK-US. April, we had US. 6 weeks ago, we had France. 2 weeks ago, we had the US. Now we have France and Japan again. We're all in this together, which is that just as the advanced world is at the foothills of a 3 to 4 factor order increase in debt to GDP as populations age, we've had this normalization of inflation, this normalization of interest rates, and the natural buyer of this stuff, which is basically pension funds, has said, we've got all we need, really. And so now we're paying prices for this debt that the private sector cannot tolerate. I don't see an easy way out of this until, again, one country just says, okay, let's just deal with these long-term debt issues. I think then the market rewards them. The situation France has got is, actually, I don't really see a way out for France while it's in the euro. It had the chance with Macron 7 years ago to basically reform its economy, bring down the unemployment rate, boost business growth, and balance the books.
Yes.
It then got hit by COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, through the economy, of course. Voters said, well, you've made us poorer with these reforms. It hasn't boosted the economy. Now we don't like your politics anymore. And now you have a situation where the euro is too expensive for France. It won't do any political reform. And the bond market is breathing down its neck. And no one wants now to take the decision of either reform or exit the euro. I think you're basically stuck for a while, and this is just the new playbook.
That's a really difficult challenge. I do want to bring it back to the US, though, because we don't have that debt ceiling issue this time around in this shutdown that we did before. That debt ceiling has been lifted. So the bond market here is reacting maybe to something else, Federal Reserve, potential for cuts and so on. How much do you think the Fed can work off the data that it's getting right now, assuming this shutdown continues?
Yeah. Well, I think the Fed is probably the most well-endowed central bank in the world when it comes to the data. So, of course, it's always bad news that we can't get excited on a Friday afternoon once a month about non-farm payrolls. But the Fed, with all of its surveys and some other hard data, has a good handle on what's going on critically in the labor market and then also in inflation. The key thing for me is that over the course of summer, the Fed has basically been trying to figure out, will these tariffs, these are anti-growth inflationary policies, will they push the economy further away from the employment mandate or the inflation mandate? Over the last, say, 4 to 6 weeks, it seems to be decisively the case that employment is suffering more than inflation. That's where we're getting the surprises. And so the Fed has started to move on with its rate cutting cycle. The problem that you have now with these tariffs, with the shutdown, is that you're now adding uncertainty into the mix. And so what does the Fed do? Does the Fed now say, well, we should start thinking about 50 basis points? I'd be very nervous about leaning more into economic weakness if the long end of the bond market is moving up. Because if the long end starts sniffing inflation because the Fed goes too soon, I think there was a nice headline over the weekend, is the US facing a re-acceleration risk?
Exactly.
I think this is really the question for the Fed.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation to be in. Callum, thank you so much. Great to have you give us some context. That is Kallum Pickering of Peel Hunt. Coming up, President Trump's National Guard deployment blocked once again. That and a look at what else is making headlines in your front page news. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Time now for your front page news. First up on the New York Times, a federal judge once again blocks the National Guard deployment to Oregon. The judge accused the administration of circumventing her order as President Trump turned to Texas for troops aimed at Chicago and other Democratic cities. The judge is a Trump appointee. Next up, the Wall Street Journal reporting that China has found a way to secretly pay Iran for oil, avoiding U.S. sanctions. According to sources, it's a barter-like system where Iranian oil is shipped to China. In return, state-backed Chinese companies build infrastructure in Iran. The arrangement sidesteps the international banking system. And on the Washington Post front page, Gaza ceasefire talks to begin in Egypt. Israeli and Hamas officials are expected to gather today in Egypt for high-stakes talks to end the war in Gaza. The negotiations over the US-backed plan are set to happen even as Israel continues strikes on Gaza. Coming up, federal workers' unions go to court. More on the shutdown next. In the meantime, futures pointed higher in the United States even as political turmoil rocks Europe and also Japan. Global bonds are selling off, yields higher across the board. This is Bloomberg. It's 5:30 a.m. in New York City. Good morning, I'm Bonnie Quinn with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's what you need to know. Layoff risk. Federal workers go to court as U.S. government agencies prepare to take action on firing plans. Global bond jitters, yields climb as the French Prime Minister resigns this morning, and Japan is set for a new leader. And Boeing signals an output hike for its 737 MAX jets as early as October. Let's take a look at those markets because the US certainly seems to be moving blithely upwards with those futures pointed once again higher after gains of more than 1% apiece for the major indices last week. We have gold at a record above 3,900. We had Bitcoin trading above 125,000 over the weekend. And everything seems to be just hunky-dory in the United States, even as the shutdown enters the sixth day and we don't have any government data. Let's look globally, though, because the French markets are down 2% and the bond vigilantes are out in force. Here in the US, we're seeing a small movement in bonds, particularly at the longer end, 475 now on the 30-year, less of a movement on the 2-year, it's at 357. But we're seeing French bonds sell off dramatically. We're also seeing a movement in Japan, and you can see that through the currencies as well. Japanese currency moved 2% today. It's trading above 150, well above 150. The euro, which had been trading at 117 and above, trading well below that now after we got the resignation of the French Prime Minister, who, by the way, has only been Prime Minister for less than a month. He was appointed September 9th, I should say, and he is already out of office. Let's get to some individual stocks to watch now. Here's Valerie Teitel in London. Val.
Good morning, Ivani. Let's start with a check on French banks. They are sliding on the back of the surprise resignation from the Prime Minister. SocGen down nearly 6%. BNP Paribas down nearly 5%. The market is really starting to ask the question, just when will this political crisis really turn into an economic one? We're seeing jitters in the OAT market and jitters in the French bond market on the back of this. Well, with an eye on what's going on in France, let's also keep an eye on the Trump administration. There was a Reuters report out over the weekend that they are looking to convert a loan into an equity stake when it comes to Critical Metals Group. We're seeing those shares surge 75% in pre-market trade. Now, this will be very similar to what they did with Intel, converting a loan into an equity stake, with Reuters reporting could be about 8% of Critical Metals, who has access to the largest rare earth mine in Greenland. Lastly, let's end with Micron, a street upgrade from Morgan Stanley, bullish on their memory chips. They think that this stock could put back-to-back gains, quarter on quarter of double-digit growth in that sector. So Micron Technology up nearly 4% on the back of the Morgan Stanley upgrade. Funny?
Never a dull moment. Valerie Teitel there in London. Thank you. The U.S. government entering its sixth day of a shutdown. Unions of federal workers have gone to court to try and block mass layoffs by the Trump administration as officials signal that agencies could start taking action as soon as today. Bloomberg's Kasia Klimaszinska joins us now from Washington. Kasia, where does the legal challenge leave the risk of mass layoffs?
Hello. So the federal workers that basically haven't been going to work since October 1st used their unions to intervene and perhaps try to prevent permanent firing. So President Trump has threatened that he will use this gap in funding for the federal government to cut staff at some agencies, especially the ones that he described as Democrats agencies, the mission of which doesn't align with the mission of this administration. He didn't specify any targets yet, but those details could come as early as today. Trump's top economic aide, Kevin Hassett, spoke to the media on Sunday, and he said that the administration will still wait for the outcome of the vote in the Senate today, but after that there could be some details. Now, those federal workers, as you mentioned, the unions filed a lawsuit, and I asked a judge to stop this move. The workers, via their unions, argued that it's illegal to take any permanent steps because the lapse in funding is only, relatively short term. We are now in the 6th day, but of course, at some point, lawmakers will reach an agreement.
Well, lots of legal challenges. Elsewhere, a judge in Portland has blocked the president's efforts to send California's National Guard troops to the city. What's the latest there?
So this is the issue of the Trump administration trying to federalize law enforcement in cities that are run by Democrats. D.C. is a good example of that. Memphis is another. And now Trump focused on Portland, saying that he needs to send National Guard there to stop the protests. He was first trying to use the Oregon National Guard, and the judge stopped that on Saturday. So then the Trump administration was trying to deploy the National Guard from California, and the judge stopped that yesterday as well. Interestingly, it's a Trump appointee, but saying that this isn't needed, that those protests are relatively mild. It's apparently around 20 people each week outside one of the ICE offices outside of downtown Portland, and that the local law enforcement can take care of that, that there's no need to send National Guard.
Kasia, thank you so much. Kasia Klimashinska in Washington, D.C. Now to some stocks that we're keeping an eye on in the early going. First up is Boeing, guiding its suppliers that a production hike for 737 MAX jets could come as early as this month. It's a sign of growing optimism at the plane maker as it works to win approval for the move from U.S. regulators. Bloomberg's Danny Lee joins us now for more. Danny, we've had so much bad news about Boeing. What does this item of news mean for Boeing and its customers?
Yeah, Bonnie, good morning. So Boeing has signalled to suppliers that it could raise output of its most profitable and most successful single-aisle jet. And that's a real turning point 20 months on after a near catastrophic crash involving one of its jets it makes, flown by Alaska Airlines. So what it's telling suppliers is that the rate of production could go from 38 a month to 42 a month as soon as this month, and a series of increases then could lead it to increase production furthermore to around 53 aircraft a month by the end of 2026. Now, this has many financial implications, many upsides for it to improve its finances, particularly to pay down debt, to generate more cash, and to potentially turn around 12 consecutive quarters of losses. Boeing can only do this, though, in conjunction with the US Federal Aviation Administration, if they can prove with its suppliers that it can increase production and the quality of that safely. Now, this is great news for airlines who are waiting on these jets, purely because we have seen this huge global supply chain crunch for new jets. And Boeing has not been immune, nor has Airbus, from delaying deliveries of new aircraft. And the airline industry, airlines are really keen to grow, and they can't do so quickly because plane makers like Boeing and Airbus cannot produce the planes nearly as quickly enough.
And it already has to convince the FAA that it can, up its quality, with the amount that it's already putting out per month, never mind upping the amount that it's putting out. But if it could get this hike into gear, would that bring it up to speed with Airbus?
It's really fascinating because it has fallen behind over the last several years. Particularly stems back to this fatal twin crashes of the 737 MAX in 2018 and 2019. And it is a bit of a watershed moment because as of this month, despite the fact that Boeing has had a 20-year lead in the production of the 737, the fact that Boeing and Airbus has been able to come on the scene later is actually now producing as many jets and has delivered as many as Boeing. So for Boeing, it really has to catch up and to try and nullify this fast and very, very well sold Airbus rivaling jet. So clearly there's a lot for Boeing to catch up on, and this is really the start of hopefully a clear turnaround under CEO Kelly Ottberg.
Exactly. Danny, thank you so much. Bloomberg aviation and transport reporter Danny Lee there. Well, we're staying in the space, turning to autos. Shares of Aston Martin falling pretty precipitously after the company cut its outlook for the second time, citing US tariffs. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Craig Trudell. What does this mean for Aston Martin, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, in short, this is a bit of a mess for UK car makers broadly, where while there was an agreement with the US government to, get some relief for car makers from higher duties that were put in place by the US, it was done so in a very, sort of curious way of across the industry. Car makers are going to have to work out, 100,000 units allowed by the U.S. under a lower tariff rate. But after that 100,000 units, imports will be subject to higher tariffs. And so Aston Martin is citing, still, despite the fact that there has been some relief, car makers are still going to be subject to higher duties, just not quite as stringent as was initially announced. And also just, real confusion, I think, sort of abounds for this industry of how exactly that 100,000 unit cap is going to work out in the future. So Aston Martin, has also had, we should note, the last few years, plenty of its own sort of missteps, and that's leading to some real frustration from its investor base this morning.
We need a new Bond movie. Meanwhile, Stellantis planning to invest about $10 billion in the United States. Stellantis already with problems of its own. So how can it afford this? Or is this a ploy to get President Trump to be maybe a little bit more, amenable to Stellantis?
I think there's definitely some currying of favor being attempted here, no doubt about it. This is also a case where, the amount of investment in North America under Carlos Tavares, I think, you could fairly say was, sort of underdone, and unions were really sort of had it with him by the time late last year that the board finally showed him the door. I think this is also a case where you have certain brands like Chrysler, where they've really been neglected. It's down to a single minivan in that brand's lineup, and so you've seen more investment maybe in the likes of France and the electrification needed to better compete in the European market. This is now a case where Antonio Filosa, the still relatively new CEO, is really turning his attention to North America and sort of seeing that market for what it is, which is that it's absolutely pivotal to this company engineering a turnaround. Yeah, absolutely. Craig, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Craig Trudell there. Now to other top stories trending on the terminal this morning. NVIDIA's production partner Foxconn reports 11% growth in quarterly sales, signaling healthy demand for chips and servers needed to develop AI. It's expanding capacity in the US, adding AI server production in Wisconsin and Texas. Pro-stimulus lawmaker Sanae Takaichi near certain elevation as Japan's next Prime Minister is jolting financial markets today. Her pretty surprise victory reduced expectations that the Bank of Japan may hike interest rates soon. The Nikkei closed at a fresh record. French Prime Minister Sebastien Lecornu has resigned. His resignation comes just a day after President Macron named a new government, which retained most senior members from previous cabinets. And that did not please investors. Let's take a look at where French assets are trading right now. We had the CAC 40 down 2% at one point, so we are off our lows, but it's still down 1.5%. Now, the euro dropped precipitously after Lecornu's resignation, down to 116.64. It had been trading above 117. The 10-year yield, as you can see, 3.58, up another 7 basis points. The 30-year yield up 8 basis points. A huge sell-off in French bonds. The bond vigilantes out in force in France, and we're going to talk more about that next, as well as, of course, the US stock market, which seems to be blithely ignoring everything, with Chris Watling of Longview Economics. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Bonnie Quinn in New York. Political changes today causing turmoil in markets around the world. Obviously, you have the LDP leader now being Sanae Takaichi. She's likely to be the next Prime Minister of Japan. And then in France, just a couple of hours ago, literally 2 hours ago, Lecornu, the Prime Minister who wasn't in the job a full month, resigned. And that caused chaos, including the euro to depress even more. 116.58 it's trading at now. You have the CAC 40 down 1.5%, which is well off its lows of the day. The 10-year yield at 3.58 and the 30-year yield up to 4.41, up 9 basis points. Well, joining us now is Chris Watling, CEO and Chief Market Strategist at Longview Economics. We want to talk about all of this and, of course, the US stock market. But those market reactions, particularly French markets, how do you say bon vigilante in French, Chris? Is that what's happening?
Well, that's testing my French, yeah. That's a great question. Well, I mean, it's interesting how the bonds sold off, the euro sold off, and it's come back a bit.
Yeah.
You know, the CAC's up a bit off its lows, isn't it?
True.
It's kind of, which I think actually encapsulates the whole story. It's a bit of a shock that he's resigned, although we're used to French Prime Ministers resigning. This is hardly new news in a sense. And the idea he was going to be able to craft a budget was ambitious at best. And the market's like, OK, that's a bit of a shock, but actually, how much has really changed in the French story?
And, you know, we're still at extremes to a certain extent. You know, for 90 basis points, you know, spread from OATs to bonds, then that's already telling us a lot. But at what point does this really deteriorate for France? Because if, you know, this government collapses, what's next?
Well, I think, as long as Macron doesn't resign, there's some sort of semblance of stability, let's put it that way. I think the problem with French politics is it's so disparate. There's so many different political parties making some sort of progress, obviously with the sort of right-wing party. Then, of course, you've got the centrists and the left-wing. I think there's no clear path to a strong government. And there's no clear path to a strong government that would have fiscal discipline. So I suspect that the real risk here is you know, the politics falls over, and as I said, I don't think it will because Macron's probably going to stay. We'll find out, but I would imagine he would. But it's if you get new governments who aren't fiscally prudent, who are happy to open their purse strings, then I think you'll see basically the ECB effectively becoming the disciplining mechanism on French government bonds. It's the backstop here is the TPI. You know, the ECB will enact the TPI if there's a real problem. But they'll only enact it if the French accept some sort of discipline. So that's the interesting dynamic, I think. And
as you say, we're seeing somebody elected in Japan who may open the purse strings, and that's causing Japanese markets to rally big today, but the yen to weaken as well. Let's move back to the US because we are entering day 6 of a shutdown. And you said in your note that this bull market is showing signs of frothiness, speculative excess and euphoria. So you wrote this. Increasingly, this market has the key features of a bubble, including strong momentum, making it hard to bet against it. So if that's the case, are you all in?
For advice.
Right. Are you all in or are
it's
you
not very helpful, is it?
No.
Well, I mean, it's clearly got so many. I mean, just look at the way some of these stocks behaved in the last month. I mean, Oracle's the one everyone talks about, but there's tons of them. Or the revaluation of OpenAI up to 500 billion from 400 billion earlier this year, even though it's losing more money. And if you look at something stock like Palantir, I know I was off a lot on Friday, but pre-Friday it was trading, I think, on 70 times sales. Now, if you go back to March 2000, there are no stocks as expensive as that on price to sales in the S&P 500. So the surge in large-cap stocks, the valuation excess, all of this is very bubble-like. There's no two ways about it. And I think if you layer on top of that, a lot of this CapEx is a very short CapEx cycle. This is not like we're laying railroads that are still here and we're still using them. After 2 or 3 years, they've got to double down. If you're doubling down, you've got to make money quick. So there's a lot of supply, which is classic bubble. You've got CapEx cycles that are short. You've got crazy valuations. So, and on top of that, everything else you mentioned, froth, speculative excess, greediness, etc.
Well, and the idea that we don't quite know where the profits are going to come from either. How are these, you know, products going to make money? So sure, storage, yes, that's fine. You know how that's going to make money for you, but what about the rest of it? So what would you advise somebody to do right now if they had money to play around, or gains?
Well, you know, I mean, in the US market, we had a very good first half of the year, and we're sort of kind of just standing back and going flat, if you like, not betting against it, but not. But I wouldn't be surprised if it had a bit of quite a pullback in the next month. And I think I would use that as an opportunity to step in. But also what I'd do is I'd look to broaden across global markets. You know, you talked about France. OK, fine. I wouldn't bother with France, frankly. I mean, I don't mean that. I love France. But I wouldn't bother with French assets. You wait till there's some more stability. But the rest of the world, some of it is really breaking out. China's doing well.
But it's done. That's the thing. Are they done? So you saw 20% gains already for Japan this year. You've seen the same for China this year. I mean, 20% is a good gain.
It is a good game, but I think when you look beyond, I think what we're seeing is a broadening of this global stock market away from just the US. And it's been brewing for 12, 18 months. You look at someone like Spain. We've been pushing Spain for a while. It's outperforming the S&P. It's pretty much outperforming the NASDAQ over certain time frames. It's doing very, very well. So, OK, you can't put a lot of money in there if you're a big US investor, but you can put a bit. You know, you could, South Korea's doing well. Taiwan, South Africa's doing... There's so many countries where there are good gains. And I think the point is we're in a global rate-cutting cycle. You know, so liquidity's getting freer. So equities globally can do well and they can broaden out. And I actually think we're going to get a global cyclical recovery coming through over the next 12, 18 months.
What about the bond universe? Too jittery, too yippy to play with?
Well, go to ones you're more confident on the fiscal side. I mean, I actually think British bonds, you know, apart from there's a lot of chat about problems in Britain, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as it is in France. And I don't say that as a Briton, our classic sort of, you know, British-French relationship. We love the French, but I think that it's more governable, Britain, than France is at the moment. Politically more governable. And the Labour Party's trying to get a hold of the public finances, and therefore the bonds are quite attractive.
Think Rachel Reeves is doing a good job?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan, but she's doing a good enough job.
Yeah.
And I think with Keir Starmer seemingly backing her, they can do enough to make those bonds interesting.
We actually have to leave it there, Chris. Could speak to you all day with Chris Watling of Longview Economics. Coming up, we'll get you set up for your week ahead. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Brief. I'm Vonnie Quinn in New York. Now a look at what's ahead this week. Talks between Israel and Hamas begin today. The latest Fed minutes coming out on Wednesday, and Chair Powell's remarks will come on Thursday. Lots more to be watched this week, of course, including the government shutdown, but those are some of the things that the markets will be eyeing. Today, markets are looking at some of these stocks, moving higher, all of them in the pre-market. Boeing, of course, said to be preparing for a 737 output hike as soon as October, if it can get the FAA on board as well, of course. Micron higher. Morgan Stanley is upgrading that stock to overweight on earnings potential, says it sees double-digit price increases for the next several quarters. And we have Nvidia as well, higher on the back of that. We also have critical metals higher. Reuters reporting the US may take a loan for equity stake. Let's take a look at the macro environment, because we have a lot going on today. We have a lot going on in Europe with the French Prime Minister resigning, Japan as well with the new LDP leader, presumptive next Prime Minister. S&P futures pointing higher after more records last week. The US dollar is stronger, as you can imagine. We're seeing a weaker yen by 2% today and a much weaker euro to the tune of about 0.7%. The 10-year yield up 3 basis points. That's it for Bloomberg Brief. Surveillance is right next.